Hey everybody, thank you for coming to my reading. I am Acks, and this is for the queer SF&F themed readings. Basically, in my writing, I write science fiction and fantasy. You can pretty much assume that everybody is queer unless they are obviously the token hetero. I also, like, a lot of my writing has like a found family theme in it, which is a thing, like a very queer theme that I explore a lot. And if you are interested in finding out more about what I write, you can go to my website, which is katsudan.net, or alexacks.com, alexacks.com. And that's got like my novels and my books and all of my short stories, most of which are freely available to read online. So today I'm going to read you a little bit from Wireless and More Steam-Powered Adventures, which is the second book in my little steampunk novella collections. The first one is Murder on the Titania and Other Steam-Powered Adventures. I just have a problem with the word powered. I don't know why. Forgive me. I'm a writer, not a speaker. But these are collections of like linked novellas where hopefully you can just read one and it'll stand alone fairly well on its own, but they're also more fun if you kind of read them together. So I'm going to go ahead and read you a little bit from Wireless. To set the scene, Captain Ramos has been away doing something that she hasn't bothered to tell Sims what it was about, and he's starting to get very concerned because she's acting kind of weird. So that's sort of the scene we're leaping into. Captain Ramos had told Sims the barest details of what had come to pass in the Dead Plains while she'd been away, but only after much prompting and stubborn insistence. It was increasingly obvious that something more than what she'd told him had happened up in the Black Hills, and she wasn't going to talk about it no matter how much Sims nattered at her. So now he had his own plan. It wasn't a terribly complex one. In fact, it had only one step, which had been, see if Miss Nimwitz has any ideas. Miss Delia Nimwitz is kind of Captain Ramos's girlfriend. They have a weird relationship. He felt a bit more at peace with Delia now, which wasn't saying much, but Sims prided himself in knowing when he was overmatched and needed to retreat. He couldn't determine the case of the captain's melancholy, let alone know how to drag her out of it. Every other idea he'd had went nowhere, up to and including proposing ridiculous heists that at least would have made her laugh in happier days. But Delia, he was not too proud to admit, was in an entirely different league from him. Her brain worked in the same disturbingly twisty ways as the captain's, which he did his best to stand well clear of. For weeks, he hadn't heard anything of use from Delia, to the point he even checked to make certain his letter had gone to her proper address, only to find her house shut up and the neighbors fairly certain that lovely Miss Nimwitz was going for a bit of travel. And maybe she'll find a nice husband while she's at it. He'd bitten his lip rather hard at this last comment. Sims had begun to fear that his letter had gone entirely astray, and he was back where he'd started with no hope. Then he'd picked up the mail 3 days ago from the post office box and found in the bundle a heavy envelope of cream-colored paper addressed to him in the neatest handwriting he'd ever seen. All the letter inside had said was, "Make certain she reads the society page of the Tribune on November 12th. Yours, DN." He didn't like Delia being all mysterious, nor trust it, but he had no choice. Delia had been his weapon of last resort, and he had to find faith that there was a reason for her to not have done something useful, like showing up in person to shake Captain Ramos until her teeth rattled. Yet he found himself swimming in even deeper doubt 3 days later, now that he had this particular issue of the Tribune in hand. He'd even refolded it to the page Delia had wanted. In the past, he wouldn't have dared interfere with Captain Ramos's newspapers, but as of late, she didn't seem to be bothering to read most of them, another deeply worrying sign. The society sheet at a glance hadn't looked at all interesting, and while he'd made an attempt to read the breezy gossip, he'd had to stop 2 paragraphs in, his concentration utterly destroyed by a combination of boredom and enraged contempt at the recounting of an unseemly squabble over an expensive cheese plate in a hotel restaurant. Rich people. He wanted to drown them all in their own barrels of imported oysters. With nothing but his questionable faith to sustain him, he now stood in front of the heavy iron door to the captain's lab. It was funny how the door, normally closed to prevent the escape of noxious smells or strange sounds into the rest of the roost, had taken on an unwelcoming air as of late, despite the fact that none of its looks had changed. Sims pounded on it with his fist. When there was no response, he let himself in, as he had hundreds of other times before. The captain was engaged in some activity that involved hundreds of vials of what appeared to be sand arrayed on the worktop in front of her. She was in the process of examining the contents of one such vial spread over a piece of white paper with a hand lens. "Got today's papers," Sims said, when she didn't acknowledge him. That in itself wasn't strange. Drop them on the table, she said disinterestedly, without looking up. That was the strange and disturbing part, and had been since she had come back. The papers had always been her window into the world. She could take the tiniest details from their pages and craft them into the foundation of some sort of scheme that might just get them all killed. She always devoured the newspapers, as well as the far rarer scientific and engineering dispatches from various societies, like a starving dog that had been given a side of beef. Sims noted yesterday's papers on the table, untouched. He frowned, an expression that would have made them sweat ink if they'd been alive. Should I cancel the subscriptions? He asked. Of course not. The captain still hadn't looked up. I'll get to them. Might be some really interesting stuff in these, I'm sure. He frowned at her, turned back. Her shirt sleeves were smudged with brown dust. Her curly black hair was pulled back from her brown face in a tight bun. Nothing out of the ordinary there. Sims frowned at the papers in his hands, then shrugged to himself and kicked over the table where the old paper sat. It went over with a satisfying crash, scattering a nearly geological cross-section of newspapers from the new to ancient across the floor. The captain's head jerked up. What the blazes? Clumsy me, Sims said. She looked at him through narrowed brown eyes. You've never been the clumsy sort. Guess things just are odd these days, Sims said. He dropped the new papers over one of the legs of the overturned papers, where they wouldn't be lost on the floor. I'll send Gregory along with your dinner in a few hours. I don't suppose he's been hit with this plague of clumsiness as well. You can't ever know what'll happen when you aren't paying attention, Sims said. His dark thoughts made his footsteps slow as he retreated into the long hallway with its string of overhead electric lamps. Calling it a hallway was more of a courtesy than anything. It was an old mine shaft, like every other part of the roost. A faint breeze from the bellows that kept air circulating ruffled his mutton chops. Just before he hit the intersection that led to the main corridor, there was an almighty slam, the sound of a metal door crashing against the wall. Sims! Captain Ramos bellowed. Sims felt a flutter in his chest at that, though he wasn't certain if it was hope or being half startled out of his own skin by the loud noise. He turned. Yes, Captain? The captain leaned in the doorway, a queer expression on her face, like perhaps she'd caught some scent, but also that she was deeply upset. He'd never seen anything quite like it, and it gave him a sinking feeling in the pit of his stomach. Get Mr. Kinzer now. I need to speak with him immediately. Will do. He rushed off, knowing he'd get his answer because he damn well planted himself in whatever conversation happened next and refused to be moved. He didn't know what Delia had done, but his money was dead on it, this being the result. He could only hope it wasn't anything permanent that he'd have to count himself responsible for. And you're certain I'm not in trouble? Gregory asked anxiously. He half-trotted to keep up with Sims. The poor man had been cursed with a short stature, and Sims, whom Captain Ramos had often referred to in mostly affectionate terms as a monstrosity, was in a bit of a hurry. Sims made a non-committal mumbling noise that he was happy to allow Gregory to interpret as reassurance if he so chose. I wonder what she wants then, Gregory said, still verbally fishing. I suspect she'll tell you that herself. The door at the end of the long hallway still stood open, though the captain was nowhere in sight. Sims ushered Gregory through in front of him, assuring himself that he wasn't planning to use the younger man as a shield, truly. In the few minutes he'd been gone, the captain's lab had become a sea of strewn papers beyond those he'd overturned, ranging from clips taken from various newspapers to sheets in a variety of handwritings, perhaps letters or notes of some sort. Captain Ramos had repaired to one of her file cabinets and was digging through it frantically. Captain? Gregory asked, his voice cracking. She flung herself back toward them, brandishing the newspaper that Sims recognized as the one he'd so wanted her to look at. This she thrust under Gregory's nose. Neiman DeLuc, she said. Does this utterly execrable sketch match? For a bare second, Sims thought she might be calling Gregory that strange name. Then he recalled it had been in the gossip column he'd barely glanced at. Gregory looked down at the paper, then took it from the captain when she gave it an impatient snap. Without pause, she went back to her file cabinet and began digging again. As he looked at the paper, Gregory's face went utterly sallow, only saved from a ghostly white by the natural dark tone of his skin. Well? Captain Ramos demanded, still elbows deep in her file cabinet. It's him, Gregory said. The color rushed back into his face. He shook the paper like he wished to tear it apart. It's bloody well him! Who? Sims demanded. He intercepted the paper and looked at the sketch picture on the page. A gentleman and a lady captioned, Mr. Neiman DeLuc and Miss Evangeline Winterlong seem to have reached an understanding at Lady Smith's ball. You recall the Rail King, Sims? Captain Ramos said. The utter ball sack that had her switch at the Spanish Peaks dynamited 3 bloody times, Sims growled. Of course I do. In truth, anyone who had any interest in using the rails knew who the Rail King was, and most had a much shinier view of the man. Rail lines were the limitation on nearly all transit between the duchies. Airships, while luxurious, were far more costly to build and maintain. In the western duchies, travel was made even more difficult by the large swaths of rugged, infested terrain to be crossed, and the rails still had to be maintained in a usable condition. The Rail King had at first, and before he'd given himself that title, seemed like a savior. Rumored to be the son of a wealthy but reclusive member of the nobility, he'd used his riches to fix and improve the rail lines that most desperately were in need of maintenance, to the relief of local dukes who had been skimming them money to fund their armies or their lifestyles, or hadn't been able to agree with their neighbors just who was responsible for fixing which bits of track. The Rail King had even built new lines, engineering marvels that had shortened travel times and made far-flung towns more accessible. Which led to the other bit of the story, where the dynamite and the large men with crowbars and Sims's desire to find the bloke and at least break his nose. The Rail King had quickly begun demanding large sums of money from the dukes and the train operators, down to anyone who had the temerity to run their own little rail car for transit on his lines, and begun to outfit them with ingenious devices that derailed unauthorized trains or destroyed track junctions if he didn't receive his proper due. Captain Ramos had, in years past, tried to dismantle a few of these devices for her own edification, and they had promptly destroyed themselves from within and become useless slag before she could get a proper look. As independent operators, Captain Ramos's crew had told the Rail King's toll collectors to spin on it on more than one occasion, which then meant they'd had to find their own way through the Rocky Mountains and beyond, using carefully maintained maps of which bits of track were safe because dukes or other wealthy patrons were paying the Rail King off. And on a few occasions, they'd even had to build their own well-hidden bypasses and switches, which the Rail King's bully boys destroyed whenever they came across them. They'd never quite gotten to the point of all-out war, and if Sims was forced to be logical, he had to admit that was for the best. The Rail King had a much bigger operation than their own family-sized crew, not to mention powerful friends and technology Captain Ramos hadn't been able to crack. "He's this Neiman DeLuc fellow?" Sims asked. His back twinged in a reminder of just how much sweat that bastard had cost them all. "No," Gregory said, his voice tight. "DeLuc's one of his enforcers." Oh. That didn't raise the man in Sims's estimation. He had no use for hired thugs. "Well, he can take his tolls and, Captain Ramos interrupted, returning with a sheaf of papers in her hand. "Evangeline Winterlong is one of Miss Nimowitz's aliases. She thinks it's terribly funny." "Of course she does," Sims said. "Trust Delia to find the most dangerous yet flush person possible to get mixed up with. You ought to have known better than to ask for her help." "I don't know what he's doing in the Grand Duchy of Salt Lake, though," Gregory said. "He was out in the missions before. That was his area because he hates Mexicans, and the king thought it was funny." "That is something we will find out if we catch him," the captain said, "or Miss Nimwitz might already know." "Got a keen nose for information to go with trouble, that one," Sims agreed. He cracked his knuckles. "I'd like to give him a message or two to send to his boss, if there's anything left of him after Delia's had her way." The second mention of Delia seemed to shake Gregory from his reverie. "Miss Delia? But she's in a right mess if she's in with him." He brandished the paper. "An understanding? She's courting a kidnapping there. And I thought..." He trailed off as he looked at Captain Ramos's face. "Steady on," Sims said. "Miss Nimwitz is clever as a weasel and more twisty than a snake. I don't think you need to spare much worry for her." If anyone always landed on her feet more than Captain Ramos, it was Delia. He'd borne witness to the fact himself. "Terribly clever people are his favorite," Gregory said, his grimness unabated. If anything, there seemed a terrible note of self-awareness in his voice. "Because they've all sorts of lovely ideas and think they can't be tricked, see? This sort of thing isn't some lark for them. It's part of the operation." "Captain?" Sims asked, beginning to feel a bit queasy at Gregory's insistent concern. "All hands, Mr. Sims," the captain said firmly. "We depart for Salt Lake immediately." "Yes, Captain. Taking Diabola?" There was more life to her than he'd seen in months, but he was starting to wonder just what he'd prodded Delia into doing. If something terrible happened, how much of her blood might be on his hands? No, he dismissed the thought. The captain quivered like a bloodhound at scent. "It would be all right. And every gun we've got," the captain said. And hey, if you've been wondering about my extremely cool Zoom background, that is the cover art for my science fiction novel, Hunger Makes the Wolf, which is social justice biker space witches conducting a labor revolt on a company world. And I'm just going to read you a little section because this is the first book, and then it's a completed duology, and the second book is Blood Binds the Pack. And I'm just going to read you a little section from that, which is honestly one of my favorite things I've ever written. And the situation here is that basically they need to get, for reasons that are explained in the book, but you don't need to worry about right now, Hob Ravani's crew of mercenary bikers has to figure out how to steal what is effectively a giant cargo plane because they need to fly somewhere. So we'll start. I don't see any fucking ospreys, Hobbs said, squinting out from under the camouflage net they all huddled beneath, out in the great salt pan around Newcastle. It was the dark of the night and cold, which made her just a little grateful for them all having to be so cozy. No, there's one, Coyote said. He passed her a scope, then extended his hand to point. There, in the hangar. Thankfully, for all that it was black but for the stars outside, the city and the landing field were a blaze of lights, like the glittering shell from an alien insect with its claws sunk deep in the hard pan. Hob felt Damballa shift uneasily behind her. After she took a brief look, sure that was a big fucking osprey, which was about all she knew about those machines, she handed the scope to him. Are you fucking serious? Damballa said. That's grounded for repairs. She didn't like the sound of that. You're saying it's broke, Bala? If it's in that there hangar, it sure as hell ain't in full operation, Damballa said. We watched it come in yesterday morning and it was flying just fine, Coyote said, a touch defensive. Probably some backup system warning light that they have to inspect away. You don't know that, Damballa said. This ain't some motorcycle with an overheat light you can ignore, you dumb asshole. I ain't flying something just to have it fall out of the sky, in case you couldn't tell. Damballa and Coyote are murder husbands. Hob still wasn't certain how Damballa had suddenly transformed into a pilot, or why Coyote had known this about him. She wanted to ask, but it definitely fell under the no talking about anyone's life before they were a wolf rule. Stupid fucking rule sometimes, she thought. And, Coyote continued in an entirely reasonable tone, which meant he was at his most dangerous. It's currently unattended. We'll never get this sort of opportunity when they're doing load and prep for the next flight. And how the fuck are you planning on fixing it, even if it don't fall out of the sky? Damballa demanded. Assuming it isn't just a silly failsafe light that we can put a bit of tape over? Coyote asked. Come now, old boy. You must have more faith in our dear friend Hottie than that. Coyote, Damballa said warningly. Night flying ain't a fucking joke either. Both of you hush. Hob took the scope back. It was true that there was a lull of activity on the landing field because it was night and because there was nothing there to load or refuel at the moment. She sucked at her teeth, thinking, we get you in there, Bala. Will you be able to tell pretty quick if you can fly it? Maybe. Depending on the alarms, I'll sure as hell know if I can't, he said. But they ain't gonna let us just... I know, she interrupted. That's what Frankie and Jerry and Lycaios and Mohegan are gonna do. That's so, Jerry said. Yeah, Hob said and offered the scope over. Frankie took it before his twin could. You're gonna make a ruckus and get them chasing you so we can get in. Then we'll make a bigger ruckus stealing their fucking osprey and they'll forget about you. That's the dumbest thing I ever heard, Jerry said. Coyote laughed and punched Hob lightly in the arm. That's my Ravani. Let's see. There's Frankie and Jerry and his little crew. They make a diversion, and I'm just gonna skip over that part. One hell of a diversion, Damballa muttered. Gotta trust him. She wasn't sure if she was trying to reassure Damballa or herself. The real secret of leading the wolves was figuring out the person for the job and then just letting them do what they did best. Coyote appeared on the other side of the fence, where his previously helmet-flattened hair slightly mussed. Wordlessly, he held the section of fence so she and Damballa cut it free and pulled it aside. Way's clear, he said as he got back on his motorcycle. They're all running on the west gate so they can have a go at Jerry. Before Hop could even ask, she heard shotguns roar. Sorry, I lost my place. She just had to hope he'd have the gumption to get while the getting was good. Hop got back on her motorcycle and made sure the bone collector had a good hold on her waist before she gunned the motor and sent them flying through the hole in the fence. She felt the moment her wheels went from salt pan to synthcrete, slippery and louder than she liked. Felt horribly naked to be moving under the floodlights that kept the landing field as bright as day. Their only hope was Jerry's distraction as she headed them straight toward the hangar. And an even more important hope was that Damballa would be able to fly the Osprey because she hadn't given near enough thought on how the hell else they were going to get out of there. They arrowed into the hangar. Hop started to slow, but Coyote and Damballa kept going, looping around the massive Osprey that sat, nose pointing toward the door. With a mental shrug, she followed them to find the cargo ramp on the Osprey down. Bemused, she kept going right on their rear wheels, up the ramp and into the shockingly huge space of the cargo bay. How the hell something like this could even fly was beyond her imagining. Hop nudged the bone collector off and laid down her motorcycle, copying what Coyote and Damballa did. Find some rope or chains. We don't want these sliding around, Coyote said, and then ran back down the ramp. The hell are you getting then? Hob called after him. Fuel pump, he called over his shoulder. Then he was gone around the corner. Well, she was glad he'd thought of that because it never occurred to her. Vehicles that didn't run on solar. That was a hell of a thought. Hob ran down the ramp and out into the hangar. Feeling so small against the cavernous space took her back to her childhood, growing up in the belly of a rift ship under the rough eye of the cargo handlers. And that memory prompted her onto the boards of the far-off wall where the cargo nettings and chains hung. As she ran across the stupidly huge space, she wished she'd had the gumption to grab her motorcycle. Too late now. Back up the ramp with her lungs and legs burning, she threw one of the cargo nets to the bone collector. Help me. He unfurled it and stared like he had no idea what such a thing could be for. With a growl, Hob grabbed the net from his hands. Go stick that hook in the eye there. No, that one. Fold it out from the wall. As she worked to get the motorcycle something close to secured, glancing every few seconds at the ramp like she expected to see green bellies with guns popping up, she yelled, You got shit figured out up there? I'm working on it, Damballa shouted back. I ain't done this in near 20 years. Remember faster! She didn't know how many minutes had passed by already. Every second felt both too slow and too damn fast, as keyed up as she was. Coyote came barreling back into view. Get the ramp up! We got lights coming at us, and grab the chocks. Get those first. The whats? Hob looked around, not sure where to even start on the task. She'd already run through every similarity this machine had to a rift ship. With an exasperated noise, Coyote gave her a shove toward the cockpit. You go assist. I'll take care of this. And he pointed a finger at the bone collector. And you sit. Out of the way. Over there. Belt in. Hob ran up the second, much smaller ramp to the cockpit, her boots echoing loud on the metal. She found Damballa in the pilot's seat, a headset looped around his neck, and his fingers moving over a control panel that was a goddamn light maze as far as she could tell. Fuck me, she muttered. You and Coyote, you both thought this was a great fucking idea, Damballa said. It's still a great idea, Coyote yelled from the depths of the cargo hold. And hit the emergency line eject when you're ready to take off. I left the pump running on both the wings. Hob really wished that he'd go back to speaking English instead of whatever the fuck he was yelling about now. She glanced through the windscreen at the cockpit to see pairs of lights coming toward them across the landing field. Come on, Damballa, tell me you got this. Ain't even the same fucking model as 20 years ago, he said, flipping a few more pressure switches over. Look at the dial on the right. No, not that one. 2 more up. What's it say? Numbers. She could do numbers. 1205, she answered. Well, that could be worse, Damballa said. What's it mean? That this machine's in here because it's got a stabilizer out. That bad? It ain't good, he said, but his fingers kept moving across the board. I've flown bigger death traps, just ain't gonna be pretty. And if they chase us, could be trouble. Might be trouble then. Hob looked out the windscreen again. The lights were almost there, resolving themselves into several small cargo haulers filled with people. Not friendly people, she was sure. Balla, we're almost out of time. Is there a gun in this or something? Visions of sitting in a big gun like some kind of action story hitter. That could work. This look like a fucking combat model to you, he snapped. Sit down, she sat. Give me that number again. Hob looked at the dial. 1460, she read. Okay, he said, like that held some deep and important meaning. Okay. He stabbed a finger at another button. Around them and beneath them, the Osprey roared to life, like the rift ship taking off, but the vibration kept growing, louder and louder. That was how motors sounded when they weren't running on electric, Hob realized. She tried to shout a question to Damballa, only to find he'd put the headset on. He gestured impatiently at another one near her, and she stuck it on her head. The noise blessedly cut off. All secure back there? She heard Damballa ask over the headset. Buttoned up tight, darling, Coyote answered. Even odd and tinny with transmission, there was an unmistakable glee in his voice. I haven't had this much fun in years. God fucking help us, Damballa muttered. He leaned over and pointed at several buttons on Hob's side. This one, then this one. When I tell you, and keep an eye on that dial there. He pointed at a different one. Tell me right smart if it goes below 20. It says 18, Hob said. Fucking gorgeous, Damballa growled. There was a strange distant pinging, then another. They're shooting at us. Should we? He pressed a few more switches, slammed his fist down on a big red and yellow striped button, and gripped the small handles in front of him. Fucking morons. One of those controls must have been the throttle because the Osprey started moving forward, rolling out of the hangar. Hob saw Greenbelly scrambling to the side and heard more of the distant pinging. Then Damballa shouted at her to do her damn job, and she hurried to press those buttons and put her attention onto the dial. She felt the shift in acceleration going from forward to up, felt the vibration and rumble as the Osprey's engines turned to vertical takeoff. Another volley of pinging went down the skin of the Osprey as it rose into the air. On the panel, several lights suddenly went red, an alarm sounding over the headset. Balla, Coyote called from the back. I got it, he yelled. He half looked at Hob. 2F cut. Find it and push it. Okay? She ran her hand over the switches, reading as fast as she could and cursing herself that it wasn't faster. She'd never been a quick reader, and the labels on the switches were tiny. "Any day now," Damballa yelled. "I'm fucking looking!" She spied the switch in a row of equally incomprehensible switches and snapped it down. The alarm swapped out for a different, less urgent sound. All the while, the Osprey kept shooting straight up. Then it came to a halt, just hanging in the air. Damballa shifted the sticks and they moved forward, weaving a little drunkenly. Come on, there's a girl." For a moment, Hop thought Damballa was talking to her, but realized he was muttering to himself and the Osprey. "You got it, come on, all right." His tone shifted and he glanced at her. "Gonna go fast as we can to get distance before they can scramble one of their helicopters. Don't fucking touch nothing unless I tell ya." She felt so in over her head that she was happy to nod. Then someone grabbed her shoulder. Coyote. She tugged the headset off so he could lean in and bellow into her ear. "Go back. I can handle Grumpy McAsshole here." He laughed as Damballa, eyes still fixed ahead, swatted him on the side. Grateful, she untangled herself from the safety belts and slithered around Coyote. He grabbed her arm and pulled her back for a second. "Smile, boss. We just stole a 500 million credit flying junk pile." Stunned, she didn't resist as he gave her a little push down the narrow cockpit hall. She turned the number over in her head, trying to make sense of it. No, too big. A little unsteady, bouncing back and forth on her feet. As Damballa kept fighting the controls or the wind or his own temper, she made her way into the cargo bay. So that is just the kind of fun nonsense the biker mercenary gang gets up to in those books. So thank you for coming to my reading, and you can find me again at katsudon.net or alexax.com, and I'm at katsudonbray on Twitter. Thank you.